I used to drive for this guy. I actually worked for him before he worked for me, and he fired me.
For over 20 years, the car tied to Dale Earnhardt's tragic demise was thought to be lost forever. Hidden from NASCAR fans, it carried a haunting story that changed the sport forever. Join us as we uncover the shocking truth that was found about that crash. Speed meets legacy. Dale Earnhardt's final race in 2001 remains one of the most unforgettable moments in the history of NASCAR. The Daytona 500 was always seen as the grand stage, and on that February afternoon, the speedway was filled with energy, tension, and expectation. Earnhardt had spent decades building a career that made him both feared and admired on the track. He was known for taking risks, for holding his ground, and for finding ways to push his car past limits when others thought it could not be done. But behind all of that toughness, he had frustrations with the way NASCAR was changing. Rules were piling up, and restrictions were placed on the very machines that drivers relied on. To him, racing was about skill, instinct, and control, and he felt those things were being taken away little by little. The introduction of the restrictor plate had already changed the sport, and later adjustments to springs and shocks pushed Earnhardt further into open criticism. He believed those decisions pulled power away from the drivers and crews, leaving cars more locked down and less flexible to adjust. What had once been fierce battles of control and judgment, he felt, had become processions managed by regulations. Still, despite his protests, NASCAR moved ahead with a new aerodynamic package designed to bunch cars tightly together and encourage frequent passing at speeds that kept crowds on edge. The change was not without its moments of glory. In 2000 at Talladega, during the first run of this new package, Earnhardt showed why he was still the master. In a display of sheer skill, he passed 17 cars in only 4 laps, pushing through the pack with determination until he crossed the line as the winner. That victory marked the 76th win of his career, and although no one knew it then, it would also stand as his last. When the Daytona 500 arrived in 2001, the atmosphere felt charged. It was the first time the event would be held under the new rules for a full 500 miles. For fans, it meant the possibility of more drama, and for drivers it meant they had to stay sharper than ever, since one mistake could draw dozens into disaster 7. Earnhardt approached the morning of the race with his usual confidence. He carried himself with ease, looking ready to handle whatever came. From the drop of the green flag, he showed his competitive edge, running up front and leading 17 laps along the way. The race itself had long stretches of intense speed with little interruption. Only 2 cautions came during the first 3 quarters of the event. The first came when Jeff Purvis struck the wall on lap 49, and the second when young rookie Kurt Busch clipped the wall trying to make a move on Joe Nemechek, sending his car sliding through the infield before it came across pit road. Other than those incidents, the field kept pressing forward in tightly packed formation. By lap 173, Earnhardt's position had him running in 7th place, sitting behind his own team's cars. Michael Waltrip, driving the blue number 15 Chevrolet, was leading the race while Earnhardt's son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., followed in second with his red number 8 car. For a man who had spent years building a racing empire, seeing his team control the front was powerful. Yet the speedway was unforgiving. On that lap, chaos erupted in what became one of the largest crashes of the day. It started when Robbie Gordon and Ward Burton made contact at the exit of Turn 2. The bump sent Ward's car across, triggering a chain reaction that spread through the pack. Tony Stewart was struck. He spun backward into the outside wall and lifted into the air, flipping twice before landing hard. His car came down across Bobby Labante's hood before it finally tumbled to the grass infield. Behind them, Bobby and Terry Labonte, Jeff Gordon, Rusty and Kenny Wallace, Mark Martin, Dale Jarrett, and many others were caught in the melee. 18 cars were eliminated in a single wave of destruction, leaving the track littered with wrecks. Remarkably, Earnhardt avoided the wreck, along with drivers like Ron Hornaday Jr., Ken Schrader, Ricky Rudd, and Jeremy Mayfield, he found a way through the smoke and debris. The race came to a halt under the red flag while crews worked to clear the track. For the drivers still running, it was a reminder of how quickly fortunes could change. Between the crash and the restart at lap 180, Earnhardt spoke with his crew over the radio. His words carried both frustration and a sense of disaster, pointing out how dangerous the current setup had become. The cars were packed too tightly, and the speed left little margin for error. He knew that something terrible could happen if nothing changed. As the race pressed on, Earnhardt had one final exchange with Andy Pilgrim, his teammate from the Rolex 24. The short conversation carried no weight at the time, but it would later gain meaning as the last words he shared with his crew. After that, Earnhardt turned his focus back to the track. He urged on his teammates, supporting Waltrip and his son as they fought to hold their positions at the front. Even as the laps wound down, he protected their chances while putting himself directly into the fight. But little did he know that history was about to go down. The turn of tragedy, the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, carried a force no one could have imagined. As the cars sped toward the finish line, Dale Earnhardt's black Chevrolet was locked in battle within a tight pack. The accident began in the last turn, turn 4, where everything unraveled in a matter of seconds. Earnhardt's car made a slight brush with Sterling Marlin's machine, enough to unsettle it and push him off his racing line. Just then, Earnhardt steered back toward the track, trying to bring the car back under control. But as he moved across, his front end cut into the path of Ken Schrader, setting off a violent chain of events that no one could stop. The two cars hooked together, and Earnhardt's vehicle was pulled up the banking. At that point, speed and angle worked against him. The Chevrolet went nose first into the concrete retaining wall at nearly 160 miles per hour. The blow was so severe that the rear wheel assembly was torn from the car. The hood pins snapped and the hood flew up repeatedly, smacking against the windshield as the car shuddered from the force of the crash. Just ahead, Michael Waltrip and Dale Earnhardt Jr. were crossing the finish line, unaware of the gravity of what had unfolded only feet behind them. As the checkered flag waved, the wrecked cars slid back down the steep banking. They skidded across the track and came to rest in the grassy infield near the exit of the turn. Other drivers managed to steer past and avoid further collisions, leaving the two damaged cars alone on the grass. Schrader managed to climb out of his car unhurt. Then he walked over to Earnhardt's machine to check on him. The window net of the number 3 car was still up, a sign that the driver had not climbed out. Schrader pulled it down himself and leaned inside. His reaction was immediate. He waved frantically toward the safety crews rushing onto the scene. What he saw inside told him that the situation was far more serious than anyone had yet realized. Paramedics arrived within moments, but Schrader's movements had already given away the urgency of what he had discovered. NASCAR's rules required that any driver unable to move their car after a crash be taken to the infield care center. For incidents where the injuries were severe, the driver would instead be sent straight to a nearby hospital. Earnhardt's case fell into that category. Daytona's safety crews carefully worked to free him from the wreckage. Once he was removed, he was placed into an ambulance and rushed 2 miles down the road to Halifax Medical Center. Despite their efforts, doctors at the hospital could do nothing. He was pronounced dead on arrival. The medical examiner later reported that Earnhardt had suffered blunt force trauma to his head. The impact had caused a basilar skull fracture, a fatal injury that stopped any chance of survival. The suddenness of the crash and the force of the blow meant that rescue crews had no time to change the outcome. News of his death spread quickly. Less than 2 hours later, NASCAR President Mike Helton stood before cameras and confirmed what so many feared. The racing world had lost one of its greatest icons on the track he had ruled for decades. In the weeks that followed, investigators studied every detail of the crash. They calculated the speed at which the car had struck the wall. The change in velocity from the joint impacts with both Schroeder's car and the retaining wall was measured at around 42 to 44 miles per hour. Although those numbers were only statistics on paper, they revealed the magnitude of the forces that had acted on Earnhardt in less than a blink of an eye. The crash pulse lasted about 80 milliseconds, but it was enough to end a life instantly. The accident highlighted the dangers that every driver carried with them each time they strapped into their cars. Earnhardt's crash played out in front of millions of viewers, turning what was supposed to be a day of glory into one of the darkest moments in motorsport history. Fans who had cheered minutes earlier were left stunned, struggling to take in the news. From the start of the contact with Marlin to the final slide into the infield grass, only seconds had passed. Yet within those seconds, the world of stock car racing was changed forever. Controversy cases. In the days that followed the crash at Daytona, emotions ran high across the racing world. Sterling Marlin, one of the drivers involved in the final lap, became the target of anger from devastated fans. Letters poured in, some filled with rage, others carrying threats. Many believed he was responsible for what had happened to Dale Earnhardt. Marlin carried the heavy weight of those accusations, even though it was simply a racing incident. He tried to explain that he had been doing everything he could to control his car in the last moments. Marlin held his line, staying as low as he could, but the impact still came. He admitted that he had only watched the tape once, unable to relive what had taken place again. Even Earnhardt's own son, Dale Jr., knew the pain was being wrongly placed. He asked fans to stop directing their anger at Marlin, reminding them that racing at such speeds always carried risks. But grief is often difficult to carry, and many wanted to put the blame somewhere. Just a few days later, NASCAR officials held a press conference to share what they believed had contributed to the tragedy. They revealed that the left lap belt on Earnhardt's harness had broken. According to Dr. Steve Bohannon, the organization's medical expert, that failure allowed Earnhardt's chin to hit the steering wheel with extreme force, causing the fatal injury. That announcement sparked endless debates. Many began to say that Earnhardt might have survived if the belt had held together. The attention quickly turned to Bill Simpson, the man whose company had produced the belts. His name was suddenly tied to the accident, and he too began receiving threats from furious fans. For someone who had dedicated his career to safety, the weight of that anger was almost unbearable. However, conflicting reports soon started to surface. The first paramedics on the scene spoke up, saying that the belts had not been broken when they arrived. They insisted the lap belt was intact when they unbuckled it to free Earnhardt from the wreck. Their account raised more confusion. NASCAR, however, pushed back by saying that the belt buckle had shifted several inches from where it should have been, something that would not have been possible unless the belt had torn under force. The confusion deepened when a later medical investigation determined that the broken belt was not the main cause of death. Instead, it concluded that Earnhardt's fatal injury came from the way his head and neck snapped forward with tremendous force. His body had been thrown violently within the cockpit, enough to cause other injuries as well. He suffered broken ribs, a fractured sternum, cuts across his scalp and chin, and even a broken ankle. But none of those wounds compared to the basilar skull fracture that ultimately ended his life. On April 10, 2001, an independent expert named Dr. Barry Myers published his own findings. His report directly challenged NASCAR's explanation. Myers made it clear that the broken belt did not play a decisive role. He described how Earnhardt's head and neck had not been restrained strongly enough, which allowed the deadly force to transfer through his spine. The angle and violence of the crash had been too much for the safety system in place at that time. That very same day, after weeks of saying nothing, NASCAR finally announced it was carrying out a full investigation of its own. Months later, on August 21, the official report was released. The process had cost over $1 million and involved careful study of every detail. The conclusion was that no single cause could explain the tragedy. Instead, it was a chain of events. The sudden contact with Ken Schrader's car, the speed at which Earnhardt had been traveling, the sharp angle of impact, and the separation of the belt all combined to produce a fatal outcome. The report also touched on safety equipment that had not yet been widely adopted at the time. The HANDS device, designed to stabilize a driver's head and neck, was mentioned, though investigators said they could not be sure it would have saved Earnhardt. Still, its importance grew in the discussion afterward. NASCAR also declared that all cars would now be fitted with black box recorders, similar to those used in airplanes. These would allow engineers and safety experts to study the forces involved in crashes in greater detail, so lessons could be drawn for the future. Through all of this, the racing community carried both grief and resolution. A man who had defined the sport was gone, and everyone involved knew changes had to be made. The pain was heavy, but out of it came a drive to push forward, to make racing safer, and to ensure that what happened in Daytona would not be repeated in the same way again. Behind every detail was the memory of a driver who had shaped the sport, and the hope that the loss would not be in vain. How number 3 changed car racing. Richard Childress faced a difficult decision in the days after the accident. For years, the black car carrying the GM Goodwrench logo and the number 3 had been tied to Dale Earnhardt. That look had become a part of racing history, and Childress knew it could not be carried on in the same way. He decided that no black Goodwrench car would ever again use the number 3. It was his way of protecting the memory of Earnhardt's long career. The team that had finished 12th in that race and had ended the 2000 season second in owner points was still strong. It was also locked into the Winner's Circle bonus program, which gave it valuable benefits. Childress worked out a plan with NASCAR to change the number. He asked for the next available option that did not contain A3, since both 13 and 23 were still open. NASCAR gave him approval to use 29. The sponsor remained the same, but the car appeared with a different look. At Rockingham and Las Vegas, it showed up with a white body, bold black numbers, and a black stripe running along the bottom. It stood out because it was the opposite of the old design. Despite the change in appearance, the team did not lose what it had earned the year before. The new number kept the bonuses from 2000 and the Daytona 500. After a short time, the car's colors shifted again, this time to black and silver. This new design carried a subtle link to the famous black car. For 13 years, a small number 3 was placed beside the larger 29. It served as a reminder of the driver who had made the number legendary and of the team's history. Then, on December 11, 2013, Richard Childress Racing announced that the number 3 would finally return to the Cup Series. The honor went to Childress's grandson, Austin Dillon. While Childress managed his team's future, another figure connected to the accident faced his own struggles. Bill Simpson, who had built Simpson Performance Products into one of the leading safety companies in racing, came under fire after the crash. The broken lap belt in Earnhardt's car drew suspicion, and Simpson bore the weight of that blame. By July 2001, the pressure became too much. He stepped away from his company, saying the stress was more than he could handle. Before long, lawyers for Simpson's company pushed NASCAR to make a clear statement about the belt. They wanted it firmly said that the product itself had no flaws. The findings showed that the belts were built well and met NASCAR's standards. What went wrong was tied to how the belt had been installed in the car, not to its design. The break in the left lap belt came from improper installation, not from weak materials or bad workmanship. It was also determined that the broken belt did not directly cause Earnhardt's death. With those details laid out, Simpson slowly stepped back into the safety world. After a year away, once his non-compete agreement expired, he launched Impact Racing products and worked to rebuild his place in the industry. The accident, however, changed the sport in lasting ways. Concerns about safety pushed NASCAR and the teams to rethink their equipment. Many crews moved away from the traditional 5-point safety harnesses and switched to 6-point versions that gave drivers more protection. By August 21, 2001, the official investigation results were made public. At first, NASCAR did not force drivers to adopt the Hans device, but the conversation around head and neck restraints grew stronger. In the years that followed, the Hans device became standard. Tracks also began to install safer barriers, which absorbed energy during crashes and protected drivers from the hardest hits. What came out of that dark time was a stronger focus on keeping drivers safe. Shadows and scars. 2 decades had passed since the day Dale Earnhardt lost his life at Daytona, yet his presence still lingered in every corner of the sport. Over time, rules were tightened, cars were rebuilt, and barriers were reinforced. Even with all those steps taken, drivers never stopped pointing out that there was always room for more. Safety in racing had never been a finish line that could be crossed once and for all. It was a path that stretched on, and every season revealed new flaws that had to be addressed. The machines on the track became stronger, the gear became tougher. But no driver could ever convince themselves that danger had been erased. The sport carried the memory of that February day in 2001 as a permanent mark. The reality was that motorsports would always carry risk. It could be reduced, controlled, and managed, but never erased. That truth hung over every race, reminding fans and drivers alike that a fatal crash could one day happen again. Back in the earlier years, there was a darker acceptance of tragedy inside the NASCAR garage. Death was treated as part of the trade, meant to be endured until it struck a figure so legendary that it forced everyone to face what had been ignored. When Earnhardt was killed, that moment arrived. The weight of losing a champion made the sport turn its head and reshape itself. What followed was not a single act of change, but an ongoing effort, a drive to push forward no matter how much had already been done. Every driver who strapped into a stock car afterward carried more than their own dreams. They carried the influence of the man whose crash had rewritten the sport's direction. For Dale Earnhardt Jr., that legacy had a very personal layer. When he thought of his father, his mind did not rush toward the changes in safety or the equipment that bore his influence. Gratitude for those things existed, but it was secondary. What weighed heavier was the absence itself, the gap left behind that could never be filled by devices or barriers. There were moments when the thought of survival brought relief, moments when he could look around at drivers like Ryan Newman, who walked away from brutal wrecks, and see how much had been preserved because of the hard lessons from that February afternoon. Still, beneath that gratitude, lived a longing for a presence that could no longer be reached. He imagined conversations that would never happen, imagined his father standing close by, listening, responding, sharing thoughts not just about racing, but about family and life. The absence stretched into daily life, into family gatherings, into moments where advice or laughter would have meant more than any trophy. The thought of having him there, hearing his voice, and receiving his opinion was a wound that never truly healed. Racing moved on, rules changed, cars grew stronger, and the sport evolved into something safer. But for those closest to him, the absence remained sharp. The larger world of NASCAR pressed forward with determination, finding new ways to push safety forward, studying accidents, and making changes before tragedy forced their hand. The cycle of improvement never stopped. But even with every adjustment, every strengthened part, and every redesigned wall, the shadow of that February day never lifted. It stayed as both a reminder of loss and a drive to ensure fewer families would endure the same pain. That absence became part of the sport's story, just as much as the victories and the records.